Okay, so just to remind you guys where we were, so last time we talked about kind of the basic sort of setup of models of thinking about credit. So we had adverse selection, moral hazard, we had monitoring models, and so on and so forth. And today what I want to talk about is microcredit, microfinance. And in particular, just, I'll give you just a couple of words of background on some of the history of microfinance. We'll talk a little bit about the impact of microfinance, both overall and some heterogeneous impacts. And then I'm going to talk about the role of particular microfinance institutions. And what I want to emphasize on this piece is that, as you'll see, microfinance is kind of a bundle of many different things. And there's sort of been a nice series of research papers over a series of years that tried to sort of help us unpack kind of what's in that bundle. And I think that you'll see some nice elements of that. Okay. So just a bit of background. So microfinance, sort of the modern microfinance model, I guess, was came through the sort of the Grameen Bank, which Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, helped create. And that sort of made small loans to women in Bangladesh, to poor women in Bangladesh. I think actually these numbers are actually probably small. I think it's way more than 25 billion today. Probably these products are outdated. Hundreds of millions of clients, typically higher payment rates. Some microfinance institutions are profitable, some are not. And these microfinance institutions are, they're lending to a large numbers of sort of small borrowers and providing them small loans, $50, $100, $500, kind of in that maybe up to $1,000, maybe that would be a really big loan, small loans. And there's an idea that these can be really powerful for sort of helping break some of the credit constraints that we talked about last time, right? So if you thought some of the stuff at the end of this, some of the models we talked about last time would predict that sort of people who are really poor would not be able to borrow anything or very little. And if there's a way to sort of break those credit constraints and figure out a way to sort of solve that, that could potentially be very powerful. So I would say, suppose we wanted to start by sort of understanding, and I should say there were lots of grand claims associated with microcredit, right? So if you think of sort of when Yunus wins the Nobel Prize, the idea is like this microcredit thing has been totally transformative to lots of people and sort of like change people's lives in lots of ways. So if you were trying to think about trying to understand and evaluate some of these claims, like what are some questions you'd want to answer? How would you think about evaluating them? What are some questions you'd want to know about microfinance? This is now a question I'm posing to you. Yeah, Rebecca.
You'd want to know if they just substitute away from like some other form of lending.
Okay, right. So you want to know is the change in sort of net access to credit, not just gross, right? So like just the fact that people are borrowing from microfinance institutions doesn't mean they're getting more credit. What else do you want to know?
Individual level, just access to outcomes.
Like, okay, so right, so like what kind of outcomes?
Business profits.
What's that?
Business profits, consumption.
Right, right. So it seems like one thing you'd want to know is like, is it about change? Is it actually sort of, if you believe that people are credit constrained, right? That they aren't sort of, if we believe that we're in a world where basically people can, if we're in the world people are unconstrained, right? That sort of like that. In the unconstrained world, right, where you have f prime of k equals r, you'd expect the marginal return to capital is not super high, right? It's equal to the interest rate. But if you're in a world where sort of k is constrained, then you might think that f prime is much greater than r because people aren't sort of able to sort of get all the capital they need. So one thing you'd want to say is what is the impact of additional capital on sort of people's profits, essentially, and like if you believe people are credit constrained, you might expect that thing to be really high, right? So that's one thing you'd want to look at. You might also, then want to look at sort of downstream kind of consumption outcomes. Yeah, Reiko, what were you going to say?
You might also be concerned about information or whether people are taking out loans that are actually in their interest, or whether these are predatory in some form.
Yeah. So what do you mean by predatory?
So if you are like, if people don't actually have good information about their odds of being able to pay back or like the form of credit that they're receiving, that you would not want them to be like needing to pay off some sort of interest in the future because.
Yeah, so I think that's also related to some of the consumption questions. But I think you're hitting another point, which is that we may not just be interested in averages, we may be interested in the distribution of effects, right? So it may be, and we're interested in distributions, I think, in two senses. The first sense is we're interested in just, is there sort of, what is the distribution of outcomes, right? So, imagine that basically we had like, like outcomes. Imagine we had quantile treatment effects, right? There's a big difference in a world where basically we have a bunch of people with sort of nothing and then a bunch of people with positive income effects. That's like a world where actually we're pretty happy with this thing, and it's kind of like, nothing for everyone and good for some people. Or if we had a world, these are quantile treatment effects, or if we had a world where it kind of looks like this, right, where some people are a lot worse off and some people are a lot better off, even if this kind of went really high, so the mean was positive, like you'd feel very differently about kind of this world versus this world. Right? Because here, nobody's kind of worse off. Here, some people are actually substantially worse off, and that kind of goes with the idea that maybe some people can't sort of pay back. And if, by the way, you think of capital as sort of like access to capital as funding investments, which may be risky, it's not crazy to think that you're in a world like this. Like if these are positive expected return but risky investments, on average people will be better off, but some will be worse off. And so understanding whether the world looks like this or like this is different. And then in addition, I think, Rekha, you asked another point, which is, it's not just that we're interested in sort of the overall heterogeneity in the treatment effects, we're asking whether they're predictable or not. And so this is just sort of saying, what are sort of the quantile treatment effects like just in general? There's another question which is say, do people actually, is that predictable or not? And are people kind of able to make good, is it sort of that just there's risk in the world? Like if you think of the model I talked about last time, that's just a model of like positive expected return activities, but risky. There's another world, though, where you start to think about like some of the selection world where people are different in their characteristics. Some people have like really good things, some people have really bad things. Can they predict them? Can the banks predict them? Sort of what can we sort of explain that heterogeneity in reasonable ways?
Africa. Were you really interested in take-up rates?
Yeah, say more.
So maybe a formal microcredit like institution might set more restrictions on what you can use a microcredit for, and perhaps that lowers the take-up rate relative to formal loaners. Who might not put such restrictions, maybe in deadlines or on what you can use this.
Yeah. Sorry. So yes, take up absolutely. So like, are these restrictions sort of reducing take up, and is that kind of good or bad? You want to think about that? Ahmed, you
Yeah. Conceptual question. Should I think similarly of like the microcredit in developing countries and payday loans, say in the United States?
Yes and no. They have. I think they have different characteristics. So they're both sort of targeting low-income kind of individuals. The payday loans are collateralized basically against your future paychecks, I think, whereas these are sort of uncollateralized, typically, right? And we'll talk about sort of how they sort of ensure payment. So they're different in that sense. They're similar. They both have reasonably high interest rates. I think one question is sort of whether the payday loans are mostly used for consumption smoothing, whereas these are mostly used for investment. That could be a really important distinction. So if these are sort of screening clients on like, do you have a small business that you're going to kind of invest in? You might think those would have very different implications than if it's just sort of like available to people who have sort of really urgent consumption needs.
Follow up on microcredit. You mentioned that like certain microcredit agencies are actually extremely profitable for some companies.
Some are, some aren't. Yeah.
I wonder why. Like, what was the economic friction that prevented microcredit to exist like 20 years ago?
Oh. So so this is, okay, so you're asking, I would call this is the difference between a question that an economist in this room would ask and someone in a business school class over at Sloan would ask. You ask the question I always ask, which is like, if this was like new and profitable, why didn't it exist in the past? Like that can't be, it must not have been an equilibrium. That's the economics view. The business school view is like somebody had a good idea and made some money. And so, I say that actually not actually totally facetiously. I think that sort of like sometimes people just innovate, and then and come up with new ideas and make new businesses. And sometimes those things sometimes there were fundamental frictions. Like you might have said, oh, it's technology or whatever, but actually I wouldn't be shocked if in this case it was just like innovation. Like someone came up with some ideas and sort of said like, oh, we think we can, basically, big bank, you'll see sort of, one of the things is that there's lots of monitoring costs. There's a question of sort of like big banks may have said it's not profitable to make these little loans because it's too expensive. And, I think that some of these organizations figured out kind of a way to do it. So I think it may have just been sort of organizational innovation. I do think one thing that's changing, and one thing I'm not going to actually talk a lot about now, but I think is kind of an interesting kind of new wave, is sort of digital technology and digital lending. And I think that actually sort of like fintech and sort of how do you think about using kind of new technologies to sort of solve some of these problems, that may be something that's actually new, that wasn't available in the past, and that may sort of open up new opportunities. I'm not actually going to talk about fintech today, but like so this stuff is organizational. I'm not sure any of it, like, why was it done in 1976 and not 1956? I don't necessarily know that there's a hard and fast reason for that, like a fundamental reason. The fintech stuff where we're sort of using kind of your, cell phone records as a way of predicting kind of your income and repayment status, that actually does rely on kind of a technological innovation, which is new. Okay, so why is evaluating this challenging? Why is evaluating microcredit challenging? Like, it took a long time before we had good impact evaluations of microcredit. Wesley, you want to say anything?
Well, like, logistically difficult or like in the real world difficult? Like, for example, microcredit institutions, if they sort of believe that this is a silver bullet, may not want you, like, they have no incentive to have you evaluate them.
Right. So okay, that's point number one, by the way. So right, vis-a-vis, as long as they're profitable or at least breaking even, they're good. Right, they may think they're good, and so why would they want someone to evaluate them? So it's kind of risky for them. I actually think that's actually a fun, kind of an important point, and actually, I think sort of convincing people to be evaluated to evaluate themselves is actually really difficult. So that's part of it. Especially if we're interested in not just they want to know what the impacts on profits are, but they don't need a rigorous impact evaluation to figure that out, right? They may not necessarily want to know that the world looks like this, for example. That might be bad news for them. So I agree that's part of it. But then what about designing the impact evaluations? What are some things that might be tricky? Yeah, for sure.
There's like 50 different dimensions of impact, so you have to know what to measure and on what timeline, etc.
Yeah, so you have lots of different outcomes, long timelines. So one of you in your comments about that you sent in for today about the Hussam paper talked about like GE issues. What did I don't remember who said that. I can look. Do you remember? Do any of you remember sort of mentioning general equilibrium issues and sort of evaluating these things? You're saying yes. Was it you, Sean? I don't know. Maybe it was you, but no. Was anyone? Rekha or someone? Yeah. What? You go for it.
So if you're not satisfying SUDVA in that if everybody in your village, like if some people in your village have access to microcredit and some people in the neighboring village don't have access, but as a function of like a neighboring village having access, like they're being able to fund different like investment projects can like boost up the like availability of profitable investments available to you and also could increase.
Yeah, so say more. So you're saying something about like, so I don't fully follow, but so say more.
So if you're trying to evaluate this by, for instance, allowing some villages to have access to microcredit and other villages not, as long as there's some form of interaction between those economies, like you have network effects just by virtue of.
Yeah. So the main issue, actually, it's even easy. Yeah. The main issue is like you're doing lending, right? But people are interacting with each other kind of in the underlying markets, right? So actually, I think the village one is actually better. Imagine what would be the problem if you did this like imagine you randomize people at the individual level in access to credit. What would be the problem with that? Yeah.
You would presumably have like a surge in aggregate demand within the village, and people would immediately start like, or I guess either on the supply side or the demand side, like people.
Yeah. So you're thinking. So right. So your view is you would understate it because your view is you would understate the impacts because there would be demand effects, and that would sort of spill over to the control group. Anyone think you would overstate impacts, Sean?
Yeah, because there's like diminishing returns to this stuff. So if you like, suppose there's like limited demand in the village. And
what?
Suppose there's limited demand in a village for something, and all the loans are for local, I don't know, retail shops. Then if you give loans to one person, they'll grow a lot. But if you gave the loans to everyone, they're competing for the same loan.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you also have to think about what these people are doing with their money, right? So I think that you're right that there could be sort of these kind of Keynesian demand effects. but Sean's also right that there could be like potential spillovers, right, in terms of, in the product market. So imagine like we're all making like, we're all selling the same, imagine we're sort of, what an example. We're all fried rice vendors. These are my Indonesian examples, right? We're all fried. It's a very common, it's super common actually example is that people have like, they have little fried rice carts. And like, there's only so much demand for fried rice going around. So if like I have a better fried rice cart and I can sort of move around, maybe I get a motorbike fried rice cart so I can like zip around faster or something, I might just be like stealing business from other people, right? If the demand for fried rice is reasonably inelastic in my village, like it'll look like I'm doing great, but actually I'm doing great at the expense of other people who kind of didn't get the loan. So, so I think that that you also have to sort of think about kind of these issues. And actually, I think actually that suggests that sort of larger level randomizations, like kind of a village level randomization or even like sub-district level randomization, is going to work better than sort of an individual level thing where you have to worry about kind of both these positive and sort of negative spillover effects. So I just wanted you to sort of think about some of these issues. And there's another thing also, which is if we think the heterogeneity is important, we need to sort of think about measuring the heterogeneity and sort of make sure we can measure the relevant dimension of the heterogeneity. And the paper you guys read, I guess it was for last time, but we're going to see today, was really about sort of saying, is there kind of real heterogeneity in returns? And as you saw from that paper, there's like a lot of heterogeneity in returns, and sort of thinking about can you measure that properly is really important. Okay. So as I said, for a while, kind of, as I think as someone pointed out, I don't remember who it was you, Wesley. Basically, like, look, the reasoning was as follows. We're profitable, we're doing good. Why do we need to evaluate our impact? And that kind of reasoning was very powerful for a while. And there are problems with this, of course. Like number one is, maybe they may not be doing quite as well as they think they are. But number two is that, as I think that Rick, as you pointed out, just because the fact that people are borrowing from microfinance organizations does not mean it's actually good for them, right? And in particular, we have these potential negative people that could lead to debt trap and so on. So actually measuring kind of these outcomes is really important. And by the way, this has come into like a huge, this has really been this question of sort of, is this kind of good or bad, has led to sort of major sort of policy debates. For example, there was a confrontation in Andhra Pradesh in India between the state of AP and kind of the microfinance institutions, where basically at some point the state government said, this is like a terrible idea, and basically no one has to repay all their microfinance loans, and that whole sector kind of went belly up kind of in that state kind of overnight. And actually, I think, I believe Emily Braza and Cynthia Kinnan have a paper sort of studying kind of that incident and kind of what happened from there on. Okay, so there has been, however, a bunch of RCTs that then, after a while, sort of tried to provide evidence on this. And there was actually a special issue in the journal AEJ Applied, which put together sort of 6 of these studies from India, Ethiopia, Mexico, Mongolia, Bosnia, and Morocco, kind of all in one place, and tried to sort of harmonize them so people could sort of see what they meant. And they basically had 2 different designs. So one was this place-based randomization, and the advantage of that one is to try to deal with some of these spillovers. The idea is we're going to sort of say, like, look, the microfinance organization says we're going to think about expanding to a bunch of places. We're going to pick more places than we're actually going to expand to, and we'll randomize them. Maybe we'll randomize the order of rollout, for example. That's actually a pretty common one to say, look, you pick the places you're going to go. You can't open them all at once, and we'll just randomize the order of rollout. That's actually a very nice design that sort of gives them some flexibility of control of kind of where they're going, works with their business plans, and sort of operates on this dimension they're indifferent between, which is sort of the order. Another one is sort of this idea is sort of like randomization kind of on the bubble. So the idea here is that basically the MFI scores applicants in terms of how excited they are to lend to them, and then rather than, you could just have an RD, like on some cutoff. One other thing you could do is say, look, the ones that are really awesome, you lend to. The ones you're not really awesome, that are really terrible, you don't lend to. The ones in the kind of in the middle, then maybe we'll randomize. And they also can be, because they're roughly indifferent, they can sort of be open to that too. I think both of these are sort of useful, by the way, as you're thinking about experimental design, because both of these are one kind of problem you have when you're often designing experiments is, you would like to sort of randomize over an entire population. The person you're dealing with is like, no way am I going to do that, because like that would involve making a bunch of like really stupid loans, or foregoing a bunch of really great loans, both of these have this. Both of these designs have the feature that you're exploiting the fact that sort of you're figuring out what they're kind of roughly indifferent on and sort of doing that. And you should be aware of that in general if you're ever sort of in the world of trying to negotiate kind of what a possible randomization is just because you wanted to run a randomized experiment does not mean your partner has to give up all control whatsoever. They can say, yes, we want to do it here. No, we don't want to do it over there. Where are you the key is sort of where are you roughly indifferent in terms of either place or time or something, and maybe we can sort of randomize that. And that's certainly an approach that I've found some success with as well in very different contexts. Another thing that's really important is take-up rates are not really enormous. So that's not surprising when you think about it. Like if I came to your, town, wherever you guys are from, and said, hey, I'm opening a new bank, I'm opening loans to start a business, like what fraction of people in your town do you think would be like, oh, I'm really excited, I'm gonna take up this loan, right? Some people would, but it's not gonna be like everybody, right? It's gonna, and in fact, the take-up rates look more like 10%, which actually I think is pretty big when you think about it, right? But small is a fraction of kind of the overall population. So why is that sort of an issue for these designs? Aaron.
Well, if one of the key things we want to look at is heterogeneity, it's going to be very hard to have power to do that if we want to take up as low.
So yes, that's true. We don't have a lot of power for heterogeneity, but how about just for the overall impact? Why is this a problem for just estimating the overall impact? Patrick.
Might self-select if they believe it will have a bigger impact.
So you're gonna get self-selection. That's true, but that's okay. You're gonna get sort of the impact on the people who are interested in being treated. It's kind of it's irrelevant late. Becca, was that you were gonna say, or was there something else?
Yeah. I guess it just related to power.
So related to what?
Power.
So say more about it.
So if you have really low take-up, even if you are like the treatment is like being induced or given the option to use it, then you need to do some sort of like ID
Yeah.
measure that effect.
Yeah.
And that's going to be like, you're going to lose a lot of power.
Yes, exactly. Right. So that's exactly
Why is power a concern if our costs are dependent on?
If what?
Why is power a concern if our costs of operations are dependent on how many people take it out? So
okay, so this is a great question. So why is this a problem? Why is power a concern? Okay, now I have to do the which class did I explain this to? I did not explain this in this class yet, right? That was in the other class, right? Okay, good. All right. I did it in this class, right? Okay, good. Then you should know the answer. So why is it a problem?
No. I'm not asking why power is a problem.
I can never remember which class I teach these. same basic idea.
If take-up is only 10%, it would seem like your costs are also not are only being applied to 10%. So you could just expand the program if your costs are lower because of take-up.
Right. So you're right. So that's the question. Why would I okay, so if I already went through this, we can ask the question again. Why would I rather have 100% take-up on like a sample of size 100 or a 10% sample take-up on a sample of size 1,000? Like, which is better?
I think, yeah, I do get that the smaller sample with a higher take-up would be better. But you would partially address that with like a bigger sample, right?
But no, that's the whole point. Like, so that you have to have a much bigger problem. So that's the whole point of the calculation I went through before, is that in order to sort of get like a take-up of 100% on size, 100% on size 100 is equal to, I think, 10% on size 10,000. Right, not on size 1,000. That's the point. It's because of the square root of n issue. So you have to go, like, in order to sort of deal with low take-up, you have to have a really, really big sample size because of this sort of this point about sort of the square root of n. That was which I did explain in this class. Yes, okay, right. So that's the point. So the fact that the first stage is really low means that it can be hard to sort of pick up effects. So what's the right solution to this problem? So you want to do, by the way, so you want to do a cluster randomized design for the reasons we talked about. You have to do spillover. So how do you do with this issue? Yeah, Paolo.
You like in different villages or even like within the same village, first figure out like who would be interested in getting a loan, and then randomize who you give the loan to?
Well, you don't want to randomize who you give the loan to, because that would have the general equilibrium problems we were talking about earlier. Sorry, say something else?
Randomize it, do exactly what Paolo said, and then just randomize it village.
Exactly. So that's right. So therefore, what you have to do is you have to get baseline data for everybody, figure out their characteristics that are going to predict take-up. Then you randomize at the village level in order to sort of deal with the general equilibrium issues, but you're going to sort of look at the impact for people who are like likely to take up. So you can predict take-up from your baseline survey, and while 10%, it may be only 10% in general, it may be that if you ask a question of like, if someone were to offer you a loan, would you take it? Maybe you can sort of get 50% or 80% take-up on that subsample. And that's the strategy and how you have to deal with that issue. Is that clear?
I don't think I understand.
So the key point here is that it's 10% on average, okay? But what I want to do is make an ex-ante restriction on my sample such that the take-up rate, which I can do equally in the treatment and control areas, such that on that restricted sample, the take-up rate is really high. So imagine I do a baseline survey, and I ask you, suppose a microfinance institution was to come into this town, would you take out a loan, right? So people who say yes to that question, the probability of take-up is going to be, conditional on offering it, is going to be like, I don't know, 80% or something, right? Not 100, but 80% or something, some high number. So then what you can do is you run that survey at baseline in treatment and control areas, you restrict your analysis then to people who are in that like high predicted take-up category, and then put in the control group. So you're doing it on a baseline question, so you're making the same restriction in treatment and control areas, but you're going to have high take-up on that subsample.
But you're still just randomizing at the...
You still randomize at the village level, but you're able to run your analysis on the people for whom you expect predicted take-up to be really high. Is that clear? Okay, so that's kind of what they do. And so what they find is in general, sort of summing up across all these things, I would say they find, on average, not much on consumption, but they do find some heterogeneity of impacts, and those are sort of focused on people who have existing businesses. And I think that at some level that should not be surprising. Like, what is this? This was actually kind of surprising at the time because everyone thought this thing would like radically transform poverty. It doesn't do that. What it does is it sort of like gives capital to people who have like high marginal returns of capital, and like those particular individuals can like grow their business. And that's sort of people who have existing businesses may be the ones for whom kind of the capital is going to sort of be most useful. And so that's kind of, I think, a summary of sort of some of the impacts. So one thing in particular I'll note is there was a meta-analysis by Meager, who's also a student here, which came out a few years later in AJ Applied. And she basically said, look, there are 7 different studies. How can we sort of say something about how similar or different they are? And the thing she wants to grapple with is that basically there are differences you observe across sites, or those due to a sort of I see some differences. Those are due to a combination of just sampling noise, right? Like if I have a sample, that's regular standard errors, or it could be that they're drawn from different distributions. Like maybe like the thing really works great in Indonesia and it works really terribly in India, or vice versa, or whatever. Let me actually, I think, in the interest of time, I think I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but let me just basically say she has a sort of a hierarchical kind of Bayesian framework for thinking about this. Let me actually not go through this in detail, but let me just note that if you're interested in these issues of how do you sort of like combine across places, you should have a look at her paper, which sort of helps you think through sort of how do we think about this stuff. So let me not go through that in a lot of detail, but basically they sort of show kind of not much, not massive kind of average impacts, but there are, I think, bigger impacts in general across these various studies for people who had prior businesses, which is sort of what's shown here. That sort of the blue graph is kind of the ones with people who don't have prior businesses, and in general, the distribution of outcomes look shifted better for people who had prior businesses, which is sort of consistent with what we thought before. That basically this is sort of like providing more impacts to people who have businesses. Yeah.
Just a quick question for like framing. Like, what is the size of like a microfinance loan in general?
I don't know the actual numbers, but examples I would give anywhere from $50, $100, $500 to up to $1,000, I would say. in that ballpark. They may go higher than that, but sort of, those are sort of typical. I think the example you guys read in the Hussam paper was like 100. Those are grants, not loans. But it was like $100, right? So I think like that, and those are not atypical amounts. Yeah. Okay, so in general, I would say what all those impact evaluations sort of showed was that for the average borrower in the sample, it didn't do very much, but there were two important caveats. Number one, those were there may be a sample selection here. Like if you think about the designs I talked about, most of them were selecting on kind of more marginal cases where sort of the bank was indifferent, either people or places. And number two, there was a substantial heterogeneity. So that kind of leads us to the paper that you guys read, which is if heterogeneity is important, kind of what else is predicting returns, and people sort of know kind of what's going on here. So that leads us to this paper by Hussam, Regal, and Roth that you guys read for today. So just to make sure, just remind everyone what this paper was. These were all graduate students actually here who, when they were sort of working on this project, as at least some of you picked up in your reading. So what Reshma, Natalia, and Ben did is they and I should say, by the way, one thing I think was kind of interesting is just a sort of a kind of how this paper came about. In some sense, this paper I think builds on the targeting paper that sort of I talked about like 3 or 4 lectures ago, and that we sort of said, look, and I think they sort of said, look, there's clearly local information for poverty targeting. But that's kind of about the level of people's income. But maybe if people know something about the level of people's income, they also know something about their marginal returns. And that's a harder problem. It's much easier to know about the level than about the returns, because the level I can just sort of look at. The returns is like a counterfactual. But in some sense, I think part of their idea was sort of saying, well, look, we're interested in microfinance, but can we take these ideas from this other kind of setting and sort of adapt them here? And so it's also, I think, kind of an interesting example of sort of how, there can be intellectual arbitrage from sort of one field to another field. And I think I do, having been here through this process, I think that was kind of partially kind of how that sort of came about, which I think is sort of really interesting, and I think can maybe be relevant guidance for all of you. So okay, so what did they do? So they asked entrepreneurs in peri-urban Maharashtra to rank their peers, groups of 4 to 6 people, on metrics of business profitability and growth potential. Okay, and then they randomly distribute cash grants of $100 to a third of these entrepreneurs to measure their actual productivity. Okay, so why is it important to randomly assign this here? So why do they need this step of randomly assigning the cash grants? Like, why aren't they just like doing this and sort of looking at sort of like whether you can predict business profitability? Yeah.
Because you're trying to predict returns, not levels.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're trying to predict returns, not levels, right? They're trying to predict what is the return to giving you, right, an extra $100, not what is your average, right? So they're trying, just to be clear, they're trying, and this is an example where sort of thinking kind of precisely about the theory is important. Their goal is to predict f prime of k, not f of k, right? So if they were interested in sort of just predicting kind of the level, that would be about f of k, but they want to say, well, what's the return? So to do that, they need to sort of predict this thing at baseline, get this information at baseline, randomly shock some people with $100, and then sort of say, what is the treatment effect of $100, and how does that vary heterogeneously based on sort of this information at baseline? Okay. Question: do you think it's better to do a loan or a grant? They do a grant. Why do you think they may have done a grant?
Grant's easier to implement, actually.
Yes, that's exactly why. So they wanted to do a loan. So so this is not a case where like it was like ex ante the optimal thing to do. Like I can also having I guess been there through this process. Their first idea was we should do loans and sort of see what's the return to a loan. And they spent a long time negotiating with multiple microfinance lenders over a period of a long time. and in the end of the day couldn't find a microfinance lender who was willing to sort of randomly assign loans in this context. They were willing to do it, but they said, oh, actually, maybe the second best thing is we can do grants, and that's actually still pretty good because we can still get the thing we want, which is f prime of k. It's like so we can get f prime of k directly rather than f prime of k minus k, right? There was still kind of relevant, both interesting parameters. And this one we can just, if we can raise enough money to give out the $100, like we can just do this ourselves. And so I mentioned that also because I think that was also a nice kind of like, they had this idea and they wanted to do it. And the first idea was they should do loans, and they tried and they met with a bunch of microfinance lenders, and there was a whole process. But then they were sort of adaptable enough to say, well, that thing isn't going to actually work in reality. Can we find a way to answer the same question that doesing rely on us convincing some partner to do something they wouldn't want to do? And that's how they ended up on grants. So I actually think the grants are totally fine, and was sort of a good example of adaptability, sort of getting there. Yeah, Rashawn.
Is there any theoretical difference? Is there any reason we would expect the responses to those two to be different?
What do you think?
Well, that's why I asked you.
What does someone else think? Do we think loans and grants are going to be different?
I would think maybe the loan has more of an impact in capital.
Huh?
Maybe the loan has more of an impact in the capital that they buy with it.
Because why?
You have an incentive to return the money.
Yeah. So I think that because you have to pay it back. Yeah. So you might think. Yeah. So I think you. Sorry. What were you going to say, Wesley?
That was precisely.
Yeah. So you might think they're going to be different. Let's see. I think that. So going back to the theory we talked about last time, would there be what would the differences there be? So if they're Reka?
I guess also the stream of returns that you get and the timing of when those returns are important.
Yes. So the timing of the returns are going to be important, and we're going to talk about that in one of the papers that hopefully I'll get to later today, which is sort of like the you have to make sure that if it's a loan and you have to pay it back, you have to make sure it returns the money in time for you to pay back the loan. And so that question of sort of the timing of repayment can actually distort kind of your investment choices. So that's important. Yeah. What else?
I don't see exactly how, but I feel like it would change your choice of the riskiness of what you do with it.
Why don't we then hold this thought till we get to the paper about grace periods, which is actually test this idea experimentally. Yeah.
But also, not everyone would take up the loan, whereas everyone would take up the cash grant, right? So if it was selection into the loan, then you might see higher effects.
Yep. Yeah. So that's right. So you might find everyone's going to want the $100, and you're right. Basically, that might change the results, right? It might be that actually, what we're picking up here is who actually has a business and sort of has a profitable opportunity, whereas everyone would so they may not have heterogeneity in returns of a loan because that selection of the loan might actually get you some of the selection of picking up. Yeah. Sorry, Aaron, you had something you want to say? Reka, you have something else you want to say? That point. I think it also depends on the degree to which the loan has limited liability or not. So if you think about kind of the model from before, right? In the model from before, if you're sort of fully, what were you gonna say, sorry?
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Is it right to say that if you're able to properly estimate, the hazard rate, the probability of somebody not paying back and their beliefs about not paying back, that you should be able to just give them a grant that shouldn't do the same? Because the difference. No,
I actually think the point I think you made actually about sort of the timing is relevant.
Holding timing aside.
No, because they may do different things with it. That's the point. Imagine I basically for example, we know that people often borrow to go to school,
yeah.
Right? So that could be a perfectly reasonable thing to do with a loan, but if you have a 10-year repayment horizon, but if you have a 1-year repayment horizon, that would be a terrible thing to invest your thing on because you're not going to have any returns because you're still going to be in school.
Sure, but this is on the limited liability point. So
yes.
Assume that the payment horizon is 10 years, and all of the things that people are investing in, they would presume that they would probably make back the money before they would need to repay. If on the limited liability point, couldn't you equilibrate to give somebody a grant that would be valued to them the same as based on their personal belief about like the project working out and their.
I'm not sure I see how. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't immediately see that. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but I don't quite see it. But okay, so I think the answer is they're not quite the same. For some reasons, people may do different things with the loan if they think they have to pay it back for either these timing reasons. They may be more if there's risk aversion reasons, right? Imagine you sort of like if you have concave utility, kind of you're worried about the bad state, right? So you may if you're risk neutral, maybe it doesn't make any difference. But if you're risk averse, then I might think of, well, if I have to pay this thing back in the bad state, I'm going to be take something that's more conservative, where if I don't have to pay it back, then I'm not so worried about the bad state. So there are reasons they are different. And the selection point, I think, Hazel, you also mentioned is totally right. There are reasons these things can be different. And that's probably why they started with trying to do a loan. If the whole point was to think about microfinance, that was the first best. But I still think there's a lot they can learn from from this, which is why they sort of did this. Okay, so this is so then the key regression that they're going to run is essentially this one. So cash drop gets you marginal returns. Predicted is just how your sort of characteristics predict your outcomes. And then the key thing is this interaction of kind of like predicted times cash drop, right? They also want to sort of say, is there kind of additional information, or is this kind of like better than kind of the machine learning approach? Okay, so they also say, let's predict your returns based on some machine learning approach. They take an auxiliary sample, some training sample, like 20% or whatever. They predict your returns, your heterogeneous returns based on your X characteristics. They then can take your machine learning prediction and sort of horse race that against kind of the cash drop prediction. So there's two ways of running that regression. I think the way I would run that regression is to basically, sorry, this got cut off. I would sort of put them in the same sample, right, in the same regression, and see whether or not, sorry, that's the ML plus ML times cash drop times ML. So I would say let's control for sort of this and say, does this predicted thing have kind of additional, this local predictions have additional kind of predictive power over this? They, I think, if I remember correctly, do it two different ways. They do a different way. They predict the heterogeneity either just with sort of the X characteristics or with the X characteristics and the sort of the local information, and sort of see which does better in kind of this regression. So they run this regression where predicted is either predicted based on just the baseline characteristics or based on characteristics plus kind of these additional X variables. I don't know if you have opinions of those two different approaches. Yeah, Aaron.
So I guess one question I had with this in the paper is a typical microfinance institution in this setting, are their agents also like embedded in the community? I guess my thought was maybe like observables and like this ML exercise is not necessarily the relevant benchmark, but rather like what are institutions doing in status quo?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I think it's certainly the case that like banks in general have loan officers, and their job is to like find out stuff about you, right? And they interview you and then say, do you look like you have like, is this business plan like real, or is it kind of like not real? And like maybe that's better than their ML. So I agree with you. That would be an interesting thing to do, would be to sort of get the banks to sort of do that. You have to think about how would you incentivize the banks to sort of do that kind of in an incentive compatible way and actually really put effort into it. But I agree with you, that would be another interesting kind of benchmark to run. Yeah, Rekha.
Wait, so on Aaron's point, I'm a little bit confused. When you say, can the community identify good entrepreneurs, are you asking like it seems almost like the comparison that you're doing with the ML is saying, is the community good at marginally identifying information beyond some baseline set of things that you would think would predict entrepreneurs?
That's what this approach. That's what
Yes.
that's what this equation says.
That's
yes.
not necessarily measuring whether the community is good at is like identifying good.
Yeah. So that right. So this is actually so when I was writing these slides, I like this is the challenge with having your advisor teach your paper later. So I like emailed them and I was like, why are you doing it this way? Why did you do it the other way? And the answer that I got back from them was actually on exactly this point, that this equation, which I wrote down over here, sort of my approach is this equation basically says, do they have kind of residual information? So the test, if I do it this way, then when I run this regression, what I get from beta 3 is there residual information that the community has that the machine learning approach doesn't know? But it doesn't really tell you kind of quantitatively like how much it is. Their approach that they're going to do this way, I think, does actually sort of answer that quantitative question and sort of says, look, how much better is sort of the overall targeting with this kind of combined approach of using all this information than if we just used the ML alone. So they're answering slightly different questions. I think that's why they went with this approach. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Other? So it's a slightly different question. And that's the answer. And each regression, they're both kind of related. And I think if you get one, you're likely to get the other. Not totally, but I think that's kind of why I did it. Ahmed, you had a question? Okay. All right. So what do they find? So the first thing is they ask whether or not people are able to predict things about whether they're sort of predicting things based on about other people's characteristics. So like, do they know their income, income, profit, assets, digit span. So digit span is a test of like how many digits you can remember. If I give you a random set of digits, how many can you remember? And that seems to be a test of like numeracy and things like that. So they seem to have a lot of information about people. That's what this sort of says. I think in some sense, this is kind of the key graph. It's a little hard to read. But this is the predicted marginal returns from kind of the people in the community. The black line is the outcome for those who lose. So in general, it's the case that those who lose have more. Those who are predicted to have higher returns have higher profits than those who don't. So your predicted marginal return is correlated with like f of k in addition to f prime of k, right? The gap between the red line and the black line is the heterogeneity, is the marginal return of the grant. So everybody gets a return from the grant, right? I mean, whatever, there's the error bars here, but in general, it looks like everybody's getting a return from the grant, but the gap is bigger, sort of based on these high kind of percentiles and low percentiles, which says that people are predicting not just the level, but also predicting kind of the marginal return. And that is what we see over here, which is that basically like this is winning the grant times the rank, and they basically find that sort of there's predictable heterogeneity, that people who have higher percentile ranks basically are doing better, and they can sort of look at it sort of nicely. In some ways, it's easier to interpret it kind of just that they break into three groups, kind of dummies, like top third, middle third, bottom third, and you can basically see that sort of the highest returns are coming from the people who are predicted to be sort of in the top third by their peers. What do? They buy more assets. They also work harder, sort of in response, and they hire kind of more labor. So they increase both their asset. They both increase their K more, and they increase their L and other people's L in their businesses. And this is the thing I was just sort of pointing out, which is this is the approach where they take your prediction based on all their kind of observable characteristics and say what's the heterogeneity and the marginal returns for the top and the bottom. And these is the ones that also kind of include the rank. And the idea is that basically these have some additional predictive power compared to the other ones. And you can choose, where this does a lot better on predicting income and profits, they both have some. For income and log income, the ones with the additional percentile ranks is doing a lot better than the ones without. For profits, maybe there's some evidence that the control has some predictive power, although it's not as clear in all specifications. So what is this what does this mean? So I think it means that there is kind of predictable heterogeneity, and local people in their community sort of know it, maybe even above and beyond the observable X's. And then going back to Aaron's point, then there's a question of sort of like, what do you do about it? Do you try to elicit it from the community? Do you try to have bank agents kind of go in and figure it out? Like, it's not clear, but I think that sort of the whole point is that basically, like, there is a lot of this heterogeneity in returns is really something that is predictable, and sort of understanding kind of how do you get the right people in and select that is kind of a really important. It's something that banks obviously spend a lot of time on, and is something sort of important moving forward. Yeah, Kailash.
Do we know anything about what that actually?
What?
Do we know anything about what that actually is? Like, is it like what is it that some people possess that other people don't? Like, that drives the differences in returns?
So I don't know that we necessarily know that, because in some sense the whole point of it is that there's predictable differences even above and beyond everything they can observe in the data. Right? In some sense, that's kind of the point of the large part, is that we don't like that. Almost by definition, like the point of that exercise is there's some additional piece of it that is sort of beyond what we can observe in the data, which sort of makes it hard to answer that question. Yeah.
I think, or maybe Kailash's question, this is something I was wondering too, is like, when people are ranking their peers, what are they thinking about? Like, I don't know, like it just seems like it's, what is it that communities know that we don't record in the data? And I don't know if they like did any kind of qualitative work to try to.
So I don't know the answer to that question. As I said, beyond, it's a little hard to know, because the whole point is it's something beyond what's in the data. So it's a little hard to know. I don't have a great answer to that. Yeah. For sure.
Well, it's like, by not visible in the data, it's things not visible in a one-time baseline survey, correct? When I go to the shop and look at it. So things about like service quality and stuff people would know.
Could be. It could be entrepreneurial ability, which is sort of hard to measure. Like, I bet if you think about your friends from college, for example, like, if you were to rank them in terms of their entrepreneurial ability, do you think there's heterogeneity there? And do you think that's above and beyond what you predict based on their grades? Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, do that introspection. I'm curious what you think. Like, my guess is yes, but like, I don't know. Like, and there is like, there's a lot of stuff that goes into people's personality and their business ability and whatever that may be sort of really hard to capture sort of in a simple survey, or even a complex survey. Yeah, right. What?
LinkedIn does now.
I'm sorry, what?
That's what LinkedIn does now. They ask people in your network to rate the relative skill at a particular thing of other people in the network.
Do they seriously?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's super interesting.
Yes.
Has anyone studied that?
I presume that it was implemented by an economist who, yeah.
Had seen some of these papers.
But yeah.
What do they use that for?
So I think it is like, you'll ask a question that's like, who would you go to for questions on Python? And then it'll give you like 3 of your friends. And then you select one of them just because it's fun or something. And then what do they? And then they take that person and give. Like, this person is like more skillful, and then I presume they sell this data to recruiters.
Wow. Oh. I'm not on LinkedIn, as you can see.
Perhaps it goes into search results, and that's like a freebie that you get.
That's fascinating, and I would love to see someone study that if they haven't done it already. That's super interesting. Okay, so but it's exactly the same idea that people seem to know stuff about their peers, and like maybe LinkedIn has figured out a way to monetize that. But I think it's super interesting. I'd love to. That seems like a great topic for someone to study if they haven't already. Okay, so what I want to talk about, is there any other comments you guys wanted to raise from the paper that you guys read? From the paper? Okay, so what I want to talk about in the last 20 minutes is sort of the unbundling of microfinance. Okay, so here are some stylized facts about microfinance. In general, default rates are really low. Not always, but in general, they've been pretty low. And the original kind of Grameen Bank style microfinance model had many elements. Okay, they lent only to women. They had a weekly repayment schedule where you start repaying immediately. Like, as an aside, I think this is a little weird, right? If like, here's a loan, go make an investment, and I want the first payment next week, like, it may not be optimal, right? But there may be reasons it's optimal. The reason I think they do it is they want people to get in the habit of repayment. I think that's kind of that's the theory behind it. But as an investment decision, like, it's, on the other hand, you could say, well, fine, I'm gonna like, you need to buy $100 machine, I'll give you $150. The first 50 you're just pay back to me in the first 5 weeks, and then you're going to start getting returns. Maybe that's what they do. I don't know. Just saying it's a thing. They have group lending, So basically, you come into this microfinance organization in a group, and initially, in a lot of these models, you have group liability. So that means that, like, you know, Hazel and Whitney and I are in a group, and like if Hazel defaults, I'm on the hook for it. Okay, so don't default. That was the idea, though. So like, therefore, like, I'm not going to want to be in a group with them if like if I think they're kind of dodgy. So we solve the selection problem, and we solve the moral hazard problem, because if she starts to default, I can go, like, you know, we're friends, and I can go, like, you know, bang her door and be like, no, like, you have to pay this back, otherwise I'm going to have a hook for it. So that was a thing. They had regular meetings where they sort of met with people all the time. They had dynamic incentives. So basically, you started off with really small loans, and if you pay them back, you get bigger and bigger loans. So kind of the return, like the incentive for paying back was kind of like bigger and bigger loans. They have credit officers who basically like are spending lots of time sort of in these group meetings and talking to people and monitoring them and doing all kinds of stuff. And they have high interest rates. You know, at least 20% per year, but often like way higher. So this is like a bundle, right? And you know, there's a bunch of theory. We can tell stories as to why all these things might matter and how and whatever. And I think that there's been sort of a series of papers that have tried to decompose them and sort of say, well, we're just going to like study this, or we're just going to study this, or so on and so forth, to try to understand kind of like how do we take this giant bundle of stuff and figure out kind of what's important and what's not, and what's actually helpful and what's not, and whatever. And so I think it's also useful to sort of see kind of how this research program kind of as a field has sort of gone on, because you can see people have sort of like been sort of hacking away at kind of like, you know, chipping away at kind of this big bundle to sort of like debundle it and sort of understand kind of what's going on here. Yeah.
Is the credit officer incentives the same for profits and for-profits and non-profits?
I don't know the answer to that question. In general, I think in all of them they want them to not lose money, but beyond that, I don't know the answer. Yeah, Wesley?
Just thinking about our conversation from last time, is this last point of high interest rates something that like an organization like Repayment Bank would sort of evangelize as like, this is what microcredit should look like, or is it just something that like comes to be by the...
Well, I don't think they're like proactively saying, yeah, it's really awesome, our interest rate's really high. That's not how they sort of spin things.
Fair, but like if only because it seems like from our conversation from last class that like this is a component of microcredit that would incentivize riskier investments than you would otherwise.
Yeah, on the other hand, they can't lose money. So like that's the other problem. Like maybe all this stuff may like cost money. Like going back to the whole, that was kind of the point of the monitoring model, right? All this stuff costs money, and then if we have all this like real costs and we have a really small loan, like that gives you the high interest rate because you got to cover those costs with a really small base. So that's kind of that was the point of that. In some sense, that was the point of that monitoring model, was to say, look, we have all these expensive activities, and you know, and they're basically fixed costs. And if we have fixed costs divided by a small loan, that's going to look like a high interest rate.
But aren't a lot of these subsidized anyway?
Not necessarily. A lot of them may be nonprofit. Well, it's not clear, but a lot of them are some are for profit and they just have to make money. Some of them are not for profit, but they still got to break even. And so I think it's not. Yeah. Okay. So let me just pick a couple of these. And see if they matter. Let me tell you a couple. So one, because I'm not going to have time to go through all of them. One was about lending to women, and sort of said, look, is that kind of like a relevant thing? So this paper by Delmel, McKinsey, and Woodruff basically said it was actually kind of one of the original cash grant papers, and they said let's. They went work in Sri Lanka. They basically identified 400 households who had a small business, not a lot of capital, and they randomized them to get a small grant of either cash or an asset, about $100 or $200, and they sort of followed them up, kind of I think 6 months later, and then maybe even 5 years later. And the main finding was, you know, they had very large returns on capital. That's consistent with this idea that, you know, that they were credit constrained, so that the returns look like 60% returns per year, so really high returns. But they found in their paper there were no effects for, they did some heterogeneous stuff, and they found no effects for female-owned businesses. Okay, so there's the main effect times women is like nothing. So that actually says, well, maybe there was not something kind of going on. Maybe there was something different with the women's businesses, and there were other papers that sort of had similar findings. And I'll just note that one kind of interesting recent paper on this is a paper by Bernhard et al., which goes back to kind of this paper by this Delmel et al. Paper and says, well, what's going on here? And they have kind of an interesting hypothesis, which is their point is we shouldn't be looking at the business in isolation. We need to look at the whole household. And maybe what's going on is not that there are differences in men versus women as entrepreneurs, but sort of what's going on in like maybe their whole intra-household dynamics are really important. And thinking about the whole kind of, actually we talked about intra-household issues, maybe we should be thinking about them in the context of a household. And in particular, what they show is that basically they show that they replicate the result in Sri Lanka that there's kind of no impact on the female-owned enterprise, but they note that when sort of the woman gets a grant, right, their overall household income is actually going up. And so what actually they argue is that basically you have to be careful about sort of looking at these sort of female-owned businesses. And the other thing I think they also look at, although I didn't bring that table, is they also show that actually if you look at sort of female-owned businesses where the woman is not part of a household with a man, where she's just sort of like acting on on her own, that basically then her returns look just like the kind of men's returns. So essentially what they argue is that what's happening is not that her business has like lower returns, but sort of in that household bargaining, if she gets the grant, maybe she channels into her husband's business, and her husband's business is the one that grows. So in general, kind of their household returns are not so different. Yeah, Reka.
Are there restrictions that say that if you receive this grant, you need to like demonstrably invest in your own business, or is this like?
I don't think for the cash grant one.
A handoff to.
I think they're able to hand it off. Yeah.
Is there like a I don't know, a number on like if I give say the male the male household has a business, the woman has her business. If I give $1 to the man's business, what's the effect on the man's business, let's say investment, versus if I give $1 to the woman's business, to the woman, how much does the male's business increase its?
Yeah, so I don't think they can totally look at that because I don't think the data measure the man's business in that case, but they do measure household income, and that's where they can look at this. So they don't quite have I don't think the data to answer exactly your question, but I think that this is suggestive of that's what's going on. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that one briefly because I do think because it illustrates this point that we have to be when we think about these small household businesses, we should be thinking of them in the context of a household, which is kind of making kind of decisions across households. In the same way we had plots and people were thinking about plots, you have to think about kind of what is the whole household doing, and actually they point out that in some sense not thinking this whole paper points out that not thinking that through clearly actually led you to sort of very different kind of results. Yeah.
Is there also like even if they're not like literally handing the grant off, if the
Yes,
substituting?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Like
Yes.
Previous study is kind of nonsense.
Huh?
Previous study is sort of like useless.
I don't think it was useless. I think that well, first of all, the average effects are interesting, but yes, I think the point of this is not that it's useless. I think the point of this study is to say, look, that you want to understand these household issues too. I don't think it was.
But like you're really not measuring, like you're not even unless you're looking at like women who are like just the woman in the household. You're like really not even close to measuring what the returns on these.
Yes, that is the point of this. Yes, that is the point of this Bernhard paper. Yes. So, but like right. So I'm just saying. But people they didn't figure this out until recently. But yes. Sure. So, but I think that's kind of why this paper was came out and was published in a good journal. So I think that like what was to sort of say, and the reason I thought it was worth mentioning is exactly this point, that saying, look, if you're measuring these household businesses in a context where people are sort of making decisions across businesses within a household, it is important to sort of take the big picture. That's kind of, I think, the main point here. Yeah.
Is there a whole takeaway from here, like in terms of if I want to help a family, which side, if I can like help give grants to either the male, like the husband or the wife, is that like a?
That's a different question, which says if we were to randomize, if we had to answer that question, you have to have a different study, which is say I gotta select a sample of people with sort of both men and women and randomize who gets it and see what the outcomes are. So I don't know of anyone who's run that study, although there are many studies in this area, and it is possible that someone has done it, and I don't know the answer.
Didn't we talk about like additional cash transfer that did that?
Cash transfers have done that for cash grants, yes. The Give Directly experiment does that in the context of cash transfers. That's one of their treatment arms. But that may be different for, I mean, these were sort of larger cash, well, actually that was pretty large too, but they weren't sort of restricted to entrepreneurs, people with entrepreneurial activity, so maybe like for this entrepreneurial subset it might be different. Yeah, sorry, you know the comment.
Is there also some concern potentially in, I don't know if they're adjusting for this, but like the industries that women tend to own businesses versus men?
I don't think they can do heterogeneous. So what you'd want to do, so you're absolutely right. So like they're just running a regression of like X equals treat plus woman plus treat times woman, right? That's what that regression in column 2 is. So you want to say, look, we also need to include like plus industry plus treatment times industry, right? Not just industry dummies, but also treatment times industry, because we may think there's just heterogeneous returns. If women are doing like whatever, yeah, things that have lower returns to capital, you're just be picking that up, right? So you want to run that. Given that they only have 400 like businesses or whatever, I don't think they have enough power to include the specification. But you're absolutely right. That's another thing another hypothesis that you want to think about. Sure. Okay. I'm gonna skip this one. So another study that this team of co-authors has looked at is this question of sort of this fact that you need to start repaying the loan as soon as you get it. So like you get the loan and you got to start repaying next week. Okay. So is that as I mentioned, on the one hand, that seems really kind of weird to me. Like, I'm going to make an investment and like it may take some time to get returns. On the other hand, some of the kinds of investments that people make look like I have a shop, I'm going to like buy some more inventory for my shop. It doesn't take really very long to like actually start having returns on that, so maybe it's okay. Or as I pointed out, like you can actually replicate the non-grace period version of this by the non-weekly repayment version by just sort of saying, look, I'm going to take, if I got a $150 loan, I'm going to take the first $50, put it aside, and use it to make my first payments, and I'm going to invest the other 100. So with a slightly larger loan, I can kind of replicate this kind of myself. So does this matter? So what they do is they basically they run an experiment where they're going to nicely sort of zero in on kind of exactly this feature, and say some people are going to get the normal contract where you start paying immediately, and some get a 2-month grace period. Even this is not a very long period of time, but they get a 2-month grace period to repay. And I think what happens is kind of interesting. So sorry, what do you expect to happen? Someone else. Yeah, Paolo.
With the grace period, you might get like higher returns back on average, but perhaps like more.
What?
You get like higher returns with the grace period, but perhaps also more heterogeneity, because people are taking riskier actions, which raise expected returns, but at the risk of like losing it all.
Yeah. Right. So okay. Someone else.
Might have a higher default rate in the grace period.
Why?
Well, if the reason why you were doing it immediately, people are sticking into a habit, you might have a reason to believe that a grace period might be the opposite of that.
Yeah. So if the whole point is this thing, like you may just have people not get in the habit of default. It may also change your investment choices, and you may change different things. Other comments?
Interesting heterogeneous effects of financials.
Heterogeneous effects by what?
So say like it will hurt some. Like some people will not pay back. Say they're like behavioral biases. Some people really need to think about like be disciplined about paying back in like next week or so. But there's also a possibility that like any investment opportunity that will take you more than a week to repay that you couldn't do before, now you will get to do that. So like the mean effect can be zero.
But there may be increasing variance. Yeah, could be, absolutely. So what do they find? So they find people do seem to they use more of the thing on their business and less on sort of household expenditures. This is not totally obvious to me, actually, that this would be the case. That there's sort of this discrepancy between sort of like how using the money for loans versus kind of business. That like it wasn't obvious to me that would be even kind of a margin, or why that margin should necessarily why should you move from kind of consumption smoothing to business investment? Maybe the business investment the consumption smoothing never pays itself back, so that's not sort of totally obvious to me that they would find that. But maybe in some broader sense, this is kind of like at least I understand kind of what this is going to be like, and this is kind of like totally zero risk in some sense. Like I know what it's going to be and I can plan for it, whereas this is kind of more risky. They also find that there are higher impacts on default. So people do default more when you give them the grace period. So it is the case that there's this trade-off. On the other hand, people's businesses actually do go up, and their income goes up a lot more actually with the grace period. So I think that this actually I think also illustrates that there may be sort of a tension between what's good for the bank and what's good for the sort of the individuals, right? The bank does not care about your income. It only cares about it maybe if it cares about if it can charge kind of higher interest rates to you. But the bank just sort of wants, conditional on making a loan and giving interest rate, just wants the loan paid back. So the bank is going to take actions to make sure the loan paid back, even if that is not necessarily optimal for you. And that's just there may be sort of this tension between between these things. Yeah.
The story behind the default, instead of being about habit, being about like risky behavior.
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely, it totally could be about risk-taking behavior. I think it is probably. I mean, certainly we don't. Actually, I don't think we necessarily know. We know that sort of people are investing more in their business, doing more stuff, earning higher incomes, and defaulting more. I don't think we necessarily know from the study, although I can't remember for sure. I don't think they can differentiate between that's the default is because it's increasing the variance of their outcomes. Sometimes it fails, versus this other kind of just direct effect of I get out of the habit of like paying back or whatever. So I don't think we can really differentiate between that. Yeah, Sean.
Does experimental design allow different people to selectively taking up the treatment?
What, sorry?
Does the experimental design allow for like different groups of people to select into?
I don't think so, but that's a good question. I don't remember it well enough to say, but I'm pretty sure they randomize it after people take up. I think it's a surprise, so I don't think it has a selection effect, but that would be interesting if it would be. You could imagine that could be important. I don't think so, but I don't remember 100%. That's true. Other questions? Yeah, Ahmed?
On average, non-business spending decreases, but I wonder like if the increase in non-business spending predicts default, like the behavioral effect in a sense.
Yeah, I don't know how you'd identify that. You need some other characteristics that would predict kind of the heterogeneous response.
It's just like in the data we wouldn't predict ex post. Like it wouldn't be causal or not.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I would run that regression, but like I think you would need some other kind of X variable that predicts that. I'm just about out of time, so let me just sum up by saying that sort of like people have gone through some of those other characteristics I mentioned. I'm not going to go through them in detail now, but you should look at them if you're interested. I think they went through group lending. They went through group lending. There was some other things. People have sort of systematically tried to decompose that list and sort of understand which of those things are important. And I think it turns out it's kind of a lot more nuanced than sort of the initial kind of view from the Green Bank, which is we have to have kind of this whole package or sort of nothing. The final thing, I'll just mention some other topics in credit. One thing we haven't talked about, which may come up next semester, but maybe not, depending on sort of how much time they have, is local indigenous institutions, so rotating savings and credit organizations. So, one thing people sometimes do if there's not kind of formal credit is they'll get together and sort of say, well, look, maybe we're all going to put, every month we'll get together, we'll have a meeting, we'll all put $10 in a pot, and we'll take turns who gets the $10. And you can think of that as kind of like, that's a rotating organization where in some sense you can think of it as like a credit organization, right? So, the first person in some sense is getting a loan of $120, for 12 of us in the group, $120, which they were paying over time by sort of putting it into the pot later. And these informal institutions are very common throughout the developing world, and people have studied those to try to understand those as well. So I just wanted to mention that. I think we're going to sort of talk about demand for credit. This we'll talk about a little bit more, probably not in our station, probably next semester. So I just wanted to mention sort of understanding people's demand for credit. I guess we'll talk about that next semester. And we'll talk about some more stuff on sort of banks as intermediaries and credit constraints for larger firms next semester. So I'm going to wrap up here. Thanks very much. It's been great talking to you guys this semester. Thank you. And I've left you 5 minutes or so to go fill out your teaching evaluations, so we very much appreciate that. Okay, thanks.